So today I want to talk about the role of improvisation in the broader compositional world. Um, I started off as a composer who generally dealt only with notated music. Um, I didn't have the benefit of any official teaching in composition, so I'm kind of self-taught. But I'm also a guitarist, a performing guitarist. But in the last 10 years, my work as a guitarist has taken me into the free improvisation field, and it has opened up so many questions around what composition is for me that I thought I might share some of those with you today. I don't really have all the answers. This is an ongoing journey for me, but I feel that I've come upon something quite special. And I know that my work in free improvisation in the last 10 years has definitely fed back into my compositional work. So I'm going to try and talk about this as clearly as I possibly can today. It's not so easy, it's a difficult subject, but sure, let's give it a try. Um, I want to start off by talking about the word tiento. Tiento is a Spanish word. It's also a form of music. So the tiento was, well, let me just say, I'll give you the Spanish translation. It's from the Spanish verb tentar, which is to touch. And in the Hispanic world, tiento is the word used for the blind man who puts his white stick out to touch so he could find his way. So that's a very interesting notion for those of us who compose music with our fingers. The tiento is also a musical form, as I said, and it emerged in the 14th century, 15th century in the repertoire of the vihuelists, Lois de Milan and Lois de Narvaez. And it really essentially became a kind of an expanded fantasia. It was really a non-categorizable form of music. Why? Because it was kind of improvised with the fingers. And so the tiento really becomes an interesting form for me. It was later adopted by the Spanish organ composers Juan Cabanilles and Antonio de Cabezon. And so with this very early form, this very early non-form, we get the beginning of this tension between improvisation and notated music. And I want to talk about that tension now. And it's interesting because those of us in the West who've been taught in universities or conservatories, we have inherited a kind of an educational system which is based on the rules and regulations of notations or of certain grammatical styles like serialism or minimalism, or developing our own sense of post-tonal rules and regulations that we apply or we break and so forth. But we don't really, at least until quite recently, we were never encouraged in those early years of education to improvise. And so this is a really interesting thing because it sets up this strange tension between applied knowledge in terms of composition and the knowledge that we might have internally, what we call tacit knowledge or embedded knowledge. So this is something that I want to try and talk about for the moment. Despite the fact that as a discipline, music really is there from the very beginning of the Renaissance period, there has always been activities or certain movements, shall we call them, either in groups or through individual composers, that sort of push against the applied knowledge of music as it was received and developed institutionally throughout Europe, starting in the early Renaissance, emerging out of the church, of course. And I'm just thinking of examples like after the Tiento in Spain, in the early Baroque period, there was a movement which became known as the Stilus Fantasticus. We see this in the music of Froberger, of Buxtehude and H.I.F. Bieber, where there's this almost extraordinary level of ecstatic composing. Quite often it emerges out of the virtuosity of those composers, Bieber being a fine example of a virtuosic violinist. And this makes for a kind of music, particularly in Germany, if we consider the music of Bach and perhaps Handel as being architectonic at base. This is music which is much more free. There are other examples. I mean, the notion of the quasi-improvised nature of figured bass, for example, in Baroque music, points to this sort of a kind of a freedom which would have been inherited from, if you like, tacit knowledge practices. We go into the 19th century, 18th century, see that, you know, even in the classical period there were moments of more freedom. And I mustn't forget, actually, earlier, before I go to the classical period, is the unmeasured preludes of Francois Couperin, where these were definite attempts to invite improvisation into the standard musical practices. And actually, these unmeasured preludes, they really do represent some of the earliest examples of attempts to capture both the tacit knowledges of the performer and the applied knowledges of the composer in notated form. And that's very interesting for us today, and for me personally, and for others like Barry Guy and Nick Roth, who are working in the liminal spaces between tacit knowledge practice and applied knowledge in terms of composers. So it's interesting to watch this. And then, of course, in the 19th century, we have the development of the emergence of the iconic performer. And so improvisation would have been sort of part of that scene completely. When we go into the 20th century, we get elements of aleatoricism coming through, the chance music of Stockhausen and Cage, of course. And by the time we hit the 60s, we have the emergence of the free improvised movement. Now that's a very, very small overview, and I don't have time to go into more details. But the main point that I want to talk about is, despite the fact that, considering that tacit knowledge practices, and improvisation in particular, has not been part of the curricula of universities for hundreds of years, the evidence is there among composers that actually it is an important element of what they do. So that's something that's really very important to think about. Now, the second thing I would like to talk about is why improvised music has not had a prestigious place in the pantheon of music education and music practice, generally speaking. And I think this is really connected with the Renaissance, the kind of objective thinking that the Enlightenment brought with it. This belief in science, that science would deliver all the answers to any questions. The foundation of Cartesian thinking, of the rational thinking, not only invading philosophical thought, but actually seeping into the universities. So if we look at the establishment of institutional knowledges, what I want to say there is the institutionalization of knowledges. The institutionalization of knowledge is basically the early universities. We see already that there's a bias against knowledge which is assumed to be tacit. and a bias towards applied knowledges that can be discussed about and articulated through either mathematics or notation or language. So this increasing Cartesian hold on European thinking increasingly pushes out the notion that we have knowledge inside us. And only knowledge that can be verified from the outside becomes the norm. So this is really an interesting point to understand, that today's bias against improvisation in the institutions is hundreds of years old. And it's even longer because, of course, institutions in the Renaissance depended heavily on institutions and thinking that took place in early Greek thinking. And already in Plato's time, there was a recognition that there were two types of knowledge. One was techne in the Greek, for inside knowledge. This knowledge got to do, broadly speaking, because we will now talk a bit about that in later stages, about knowing through doing, knowing through using techniques to do, whether that's play an instrument or tie your shoelaces. It's knowing through doing, as opposed to episteme, which became the applied knowledges. So we're now talking, 2,500 years of the separation of different types of knowledge. The embedded knowledge of techne and the applied knowledge of episteme. And those two types of knowledge systems, if you like, were adopted by the European Renaissance. But as we go through the Cartesian experiment, we see that as time unfolds, the notion of techne becomes less important. And so this is the sort of tension that we're dealing with. It's a tension, as I said, has always been there with composers wanting to break free from their own rules and regulations. And this happens from Beethoven to Ligeti, who, this is a different lecture, but has, I've written papers on Ligeti, who's created systems only to break them. But that's, like I say, that's another lecture. So I want to talk about this bias that continues. And we see it in some of the great composers of the 20th century, because we hear Berio stating things like free improvisation is, he says, rare fleeting moments of interest apart, improvisation has been a haven for dilettantes. I mean, that is a disparaging remark to make about free improvisation. And he says later at some stage, there's no true unanimity of discourse. In other words, that unless this is very much the episteme type thinking, that unless there are systems within which a composer can compose, that there is a lack of glue, if you like. There's a lack of consistency in the musical texture. But that is to make assumptions that actually something more sophisticated is not taking place in the free improviser. And I would like to actually just make this distinction, is that when I talk about free improvisation, I'm talking about free improvisation at the executive level. Okay? I'm not talking about mediocre improvisation. We could talk about mediocre notated composition if we wanted. That doesn't get us anywhere. So my feeling is that either Berio was reluctant to embrace this development, which was basically happening in parallel to his late work, or he really didn't hear some of the better improvisations, free improvisations. Fernyhough says the same thing. He says free improvisation is an unstable chemistry. That is not my experience. I have to say, hearing some of the best free improvisation in the last 6 or 7 years, I become really cognizant of a really deep structure, a real deep structure, and sort of what might be described as consistent musical languages throughout. In as much as we can talk about consistency of language in this postmodern era. So there's another element as well here, is that in actual fact, we are living in a time when we are actually experiencing different languages, different grades of tonality, different types of music, from the, if you like, the very surface music of minimalism to music which is still very interested in having depth and shape and complexity. So to talk about a unanimity of language is also a little bit reductive in many ways, because many composers now who not even involved in improvisation are bringing lots of different languages into the one compositional pot. So speaking of those different languages, I want to share with you a piece that was performed in Middlesex University back in 2014 with Lucas Nigley on drums and Nick Roth on the saxophone. And this gives you an idea, I guess, of where language can go in music. There are times when I actually play some notes, but a lot of it's got to do with, if you like, sound painting. Nick Roth, for the most part, actually does not use the mouthpiece of the saxophone, so he's transforming the saxophone and he's picking up a lot of finger tapping because he has his saxophone over the microphone. And you will notice Lucas is not only playing the drum kit, but he's playing the air. And so there's this sense of changing what instrumentation really is or can be. There's another point that I'd like to bring to your attention, and that is the way that people listen to each other. There's something when people are playing a free improvisation set that they are forced to acknowledge the other in ways that even in a fine notated composition doesn't do, because it's already written. You don't have to make that decision. Those decisions are made for the performer by the composer. But when we're improvising, the first thing we need to do, if we wish to attempt a great improvisation, is that we need to acknowledge the significance of the other in the group. We need to share the authorship. And so that's an important facet in terms of the ethics of playing with each other, that there's no dominant player as such. So with those ideas in mind, have a listen to this. thanks to Lucas Nigley and Nick Roth there. I want to share some further thoughts around the connection between improvisation and consciousness. I've been very interested in the theory of the Umwelt as developed by Jakob Uexküll. And the Umwelt is a German word for environment. And this has formed the basis of modern biosemiotics. So if essentially when one talks about the Umwelt, one talks about one's environment. And of course, we experience our environment through our senses. So we can see people from a distance, we can smell them with our olfactory sense, we can taste things, we can touch things. And so to the extent that our sensory tools are working determines our Umwelten, our personal Umwelt. It also gives to us our sense of subjectivity and how we interpret the world. And so taking this notion of Umwelt in relation to artistic expression, I think this has been an interesting connection that I've been trying to make over the last few years. One thing that I feel that perhaps the biosemiotic framework does not take into account, however, is the fact that our Umwelt might very well be expanded in some way as a result of our shifting consciousness. The biosemiotic framework doesn't seem to take into account that actually we have different and various levels of consciousness and how we see the world. So this is kind of a level of perception or understanding of the world beyond the sensory tools, and I think is very particular to human consciousness, of course. And because, as I've spoken about earlier, that we tend to interpret the world through this Cartesian lens, that language itself, language and numbers dominate. So we tend not to actually experience the world through different levels of consciousness because we seem to be trapped. We're trapped by language, we're trapped by numbers. And so it seems to me that our biosemiotic framework as humans, our Umwelten, are somehow restricted by the fact that we are trapped inside an objectified universe, an objectified world. And so I think we are, in fact, as human beings with consciousness, as human beings with the potential for greater levels of consciousness, we are in fact experiencing life on a suboptimal level, that our Umwelten are in fact trapped. And I think music can perhaps play a role in maybe expanding our Umwelten. Let me just mention some comments by George Steiner, who has always been a very important influence on me. He says, "Speech can neither articulate the deeper truths of consciousness, nor can it convey the sensory, autonomous evidence of the flower, of the shaft of light, of the bird call at dawning. It is not only that language cannot reveal these things, it labours to do so." And I've always felt this. I'm sure maybe poets would disagree, but actually poets are in the same business as trying to use language in a more expansive way. So maybe they will agree with me in the end. I don't know. But this is an important point that Steiner makes, is that as we live the vast majority of our lives through language, we are actually living suboptimal lives, which seems like a really, really strong statement. But I'm a musician after all. I'm a composer, so I'm trying to reframe the world that is not designed through the objective and rationale of linguistics. Steiner also says of music, music brings to our daily lives an immediate encounter with a logic of sense other than that of reason. And that's basically Steiner telling us that music is transcendental. If music is transcendental, it means that the confines, the boundaries of our individual Umwelten can be transcended. And this is something that I feel intuitively, not only because I've been meditating for many, many years, and so I can transcend through meditation on a daily basis, but through my experiences performing as a musician or having my works composed, that one feels on good days that one has transcended something of the normal world that we live in. And again, Steiner is brilliant in clarifying further thoughts around music. Music puts our being as men and women to touch with that which transcends the sayable, which outstrips the analyzable. So here I am thinking, that what's happening here is that Steiner is actually articulating through language what I think many of us as musicians feel intuitively, either as performers or composers, or just even listening to music, that music outstrips the analyzable. And so this brings me to a series of pieces that I've been thinking about. Well, I've been thinking about the notion of the Umwelt as maybe a framework for composing or performing or improvising. And so to think that perhaps through improvisation, with a good wind behind us, in other words, if we have moments of excellence during improvisation, that we can perhaps pierce the Umwelt, that we can actually somehow go through the boundaries created by our present Umwelt. I think I'll be doing another talk on Beckett, but it might be worth making the point that certainly in the late works of Beckett was constantly trying to bring silence into his language, into his sentences and his poems and his writing. And when Beckett constantly says fail again, fail better, of course many people take that as a negativity or something of that nature, and it is. But my feeling is that Beckett understood that language was limited, that language had a boundary beyond which it could not go. And I think his attempts at bringing silence into language was an attempt to go beyond language. Beckett talks about pulling the veil away from language to reveal what's behind it, And I think what he was saying was that even he, as such an amazing writer, perhaps the best in English and French of the 20th century, arguably, that he took language right to the edge of the boundary of his own Umwelt, but had to sort of break language up so he could go beyond. And if we believe in Steiner, then, and Steiner's views of music, well, it intimates that perhaps, even unlike Beckett, we perhaps in those moments, and they may be rare, but in those moments we may be able to go beyond the boundaries of the Umwelt, to pierce the Umwelt. And I think this is what happens when amazing things happen in music, and it's what the Spanish call duende. It's from the flamenco tradition, when something really extraordinary happens in performance that cannot be accounted for in any rational or analysable way. this is when duende has arrived. And maybe there's another conversation to be had about the term duende, but I guess duende is that moment when something extraordinary happens in performance and we can't account for it. I think they're the moments when the umwelt has been pierced. Anyway, I'm working on this as a general theoretical framework, and I hope to be writing more about this in the future. Needless to say, it's clear that I connect performance with consciousness, and the fact that we are, well, it's my proposition that we are in this world living in some sort of suboptimal way, and if we could reach the optimal level, we'd be piercing the umwelt. This is the basis of a series of pieces I've been writing. I wrote a composition for bass clarinet and accordion. They were my first explorations of this notion of umwelt, which I wrote last year in lockdown, actually, which is quite interesting because in many ways our collective umwelten were thoroughly restricted by the lockdown. So that further made me think about that. And I hope to continue to develop this notion of the umwelt through music. The first four were, as I say, this duet of bass clarinet and accordion. And so Umwelt 5 is a piece that I improvised for solo guitar. Nice sound. So we move now on to Umwelt 5, which is an improvisation for solo guitar, which I recorded in a studio last year in Dublin. There's one thing that I want to talk about, particularly with solo improvisation, but not exclusively, is the fact that no matter how much we try to be absolutely new in what we do, I don't think that's possible. And I think people who say that they are completely, that they are creating absolutely out of a vacuum from a tabula rasa, I think they're lying, in fact. I think the issue is that, I spoke before about embedded knowledges, and of course, I've been playing guitar for 40 years. I've been analysing scores for many years. I've been composing for many years. And so I have a lot of embedded knowledges. And when one plays, that comes out. I can't deny a classical element. I can't deny my classical training. So I don't play like a jazz player. A jazz player does not play like a classical player. So there are certain I guess a build-up of your internal tacit knowledges, but which are marked by your specific experiences. So, I mentioned before where Ezra Pound talks about making it new. Well, you can't make anything new completely. But what I think you can do is recreate creatively. And I think that's what happens when an improvisation takes place. Particularly maybe from my own experience I see this more, but maybe not, because jazz players also have their bag of tools. They also have their scales that they can rely on and so forth. So it's not exactly that absolutely everything is new, but one thing that I do strive, of course, unconsciously for, is that I recreate what I know in a new way. It's the moment of recreation which is the improvised moment. And to live somehow, to dance in the liminal space between what you tacitly know and what you are about to play, which is something that you don't know, is a very enlivened place. And in many ways, that's creative consciousness in action. This living the moment between what you know and what you don't know. It's the knowing unknowing concept again. So with those thoughts in mind, have a listen to this excerpt of Umwelt 5. Now, I want to talk about a collaboration that I did some years back with dancer Helen Kindred and filmmaker Pete Gomez. This piece is called Knowing Unknowing. And this is, I think, an important piece because it involves improvisation with dance and with camera. The camera work is improvised. As far as I'm aware, Pete Gomez used an eye camera on a harness, so he's actually dancing around. Well, not quite dancing, but he has to be quite lithe, and he's shifting his mise en scène all the time. So he's making decisions about exposure and framing instantaneously, just like us. So this was a very interesting project for us. And when things happen in the moment, we are not relying necessarily on our applied knowledge. We don't have time. We're relying on our tacit knowledges. You know, I have 30 years experience as a composer. I've got 40 years experience as a classical guitarist. That accounts for something. You know, Helen is a highly trained dancer, especially using fundamentals called Bartenioff fundamentals. And of course, Pete has been working film for years. So we all have and rely on, in the improvised moment, our tacit knowledges. We make decisions instantaneously. And so what are we doing when we are making decisions like that, which are not just decisions like, oh, I'm improvising, I'm going to run for the bus. No, we're trying to make art. And so what we're doing is then that art becomes a kind of instantaneous reflection of the state of our consciousness at a given time. So it's embedded knowledges in action through our consciousness. I keep speaking about tacit knowledge, but I do, and the notion that tacit knowledge was known by the Greeks and called techne. and that this was connected in some way with technique or with the knowing through doing. But Heidegger has brought out an element, an aspect of this which is slightly more in keeping with what I've just described in terms of the artistic response through consciousness. And I just want to read that, where Heidegger says, knowing that remains a willing and willing that remains a knowing is the existing human being's ecstatic entry into the unconcealment of being. Now that sounds a little bit complicated, but for me, what he's saying there is that knowing through doing and willing, in other words, making decisions, especially, if you like, executive artistic decisions based on that knowingness, is actually unconcealing, which is a real Heideggerian term. You're actually unconcealing your being in that moment. And so this is where I don't really care how unpopular this might be, but this is where the making of art can become a spiritual experience, because you're revealing your inner being in the artistic expression of your improvisation. So that's quite important to me, and it reminds me of some notes that I was making while I was working with Helen and Pete on the piece. And I say, knowing unknowing executes a transformation of the unconscious moment of creative cognition into a conscious mode of aesthetic enactment, a transition from absence to presence, from concealment to unconcealment, and potentially from the unmarked moment to a vestigial revision. So this is an important point. You know, a lot of my ideas around improvisation emerge through my experience when I improvise, and it's a really ecstatic moment. So with that in mind, if I can give you just a little introduction to what we're doing in the first movement of Knowing Unknowing. Knowing Unknowing has 3 movements, but I'm going to show you 2 now. And you might find it unusual that in the first movement, both dancer and guitarist are blindfolded. And so this was some attempt to defamiliarize ourselves with our own training, you know. And also my guitar is prepared, or as what some people call altered. And so all my training as a classical guitarist is for naught here. So we were trying to figure out ways, maybe tributaries of knowledge that took us away from the main river of our training. And keep in mind that Helen would need her eyes to understand the room she's in. So she's lost this sense of spatial awareness. Of course, she hears me, and I'm in a fixed position, but she doesn't really know about the walls. And so the effect that this would have, and the same goes for Pete. Pete is fully engaged in a shifting mise en scène, a shifting moment between guitarist and composer being affected by the music and by the dance. And I think just it should be worth noting, because this was very important for us in the process, to understand this experience, this one-off experience in improvisation, as what Karen Barad calls an intra-action. That my playing affects Helen's gestures. Helen's gestures, as far as I can see them, affect my playing, but the patter of her feet, you know, can affect them. We both affect Pete's decisions to move around. Even the squeaking of the chair and the squeaks of feet on the ground are part of the actual experience. This is a kind of unified field theory of performance, which I believe at the moment is very early in its research phase, but is very important. So here's the first movement of Knowing Unknowing.